Some common talking points whenever we start addressing the issue of abortion with politics, especially from a Christian worldview, is that you can't legislate morality, there's a separation of church and state, we can't mix religion and politics, and yet we see in Scripture in Romans 13 that God ordains government to promote good and to punish evil, as well as passages and people throughout the Bible who were government officials or who were in the church calling the government officials to account. Even Peter, who is told to not teach about Jesus, says, look, we can only obey God, not men. And so we need some help in really navigating politics and its role in this topic and in our lives. And so we've invited a friend, Chelsea Yeoman, who's the National Legislative Advisor for Human Coalition Action.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So Rebecca's with me again, and would you get us started just by kind of helping us understand some of the history and maybe some of the other places we want to go as we talk about politics?
So let's jump in and talk about history. I think the next point that we need to make is how politics influences the different levels of government, specifically with the issue of abortion. I would love to be able to talk about how society has been affected by legalized abortion and the different side effects felt there. And then let's circle back and give Christians some tools on how to engage in politics and engage their legislators. So quick question to start us off here. I would love to know, what did the landscape look like prior to Roe v. Wade? Give us some history.
Yes, well, to go in history, we've got to even go back to the 1800s on abortion, where it was actually legal in the 1800s up until what they called at the time quickening, which was, we know that if a child is moving in the womb and the mother can feel the child kick and move, that it's a live human in there. That's as far as medicine and science had really gotten them. But then fast forward to the early 1900s, by then with medical advancements, even on genetics a little bit in the womb, there began to be this understanding of truly life at conception and the human child growing in the womb, and that it should be protected. And so moving on into the 1900s through Roe, every single state, all 50 states, regulated abortion, and many outlawed it as criminal homicide for an abortion provider to conduct an abortion.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Roe v. Wade. I feel like it's this pivotal court case that every pro-choice and pro-life advocate will speak into. So why do you think it's so historical?
It's this moment in time where unelected judges, 9 judges, essentially said, we're going to nullify all 50 states' rules on protecting life. And since that point in time, we know 62 million children have died because of abortion. And so it truly is this moment in history that changed everything.
Yeah, can you give some context to the scenario that was playing out in Roe? And what, I assume that these cases just come up because something happens in somebody's life and then they hire an attorney, but it feels like there's probably more going on.
Right. It's a best kept secret that a lot of constitutional law is actually made by set up cases where civil rights activists or constitutional activists, in the case of Roe, there had been about a decade of a push to expand abortion. And because of that, they set this case up with Roe, who was pregnant and she sought out an abortion. She actually lied about being raped, and then went on to actually have her third child and her third daughter through that case. But she was approached by 2 activist attorneys out of Dallas to tee the court up to make this big decision.
Okay, and then the court, what was happening? We know the Supreme Court makes laws for our land or makes rulings on cases for our land. And so what was some of the dynamic of them figuring that and making that ruling?
Yes, well, it was actually a really political ruling. At the time, one of the justices wrote in his notes, we now know that it would require finessing the Constitution to make it work. But essentially, they wanted to read in a right to abortion into the Constitution. And because of that, it was a really political ruling, and one that, since constitutional scholars on both sides of the issue all agree on one thing, and that is that it was a really terribly decided legal case.
Yeah, I think I've read that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a liberal Supreme Court justice, said that she disagreed with the Roe decision and how it came about, and it actually created more of a pro-life movement in some ways. And so would you speak then to, after Roe, what transpired? How did things change, and kind of lead up to whatever the next major decision was that came about?
Well, the next major decision was 20 years later in Casey versus Planned Parenthood. So in those 20 years, really two things were happening. On the legal political side, states who had just had all of their regulations overturned by the court started to work again to protect life in the womb by doing things like requiring wait periods, sonograms, parental consent for minors, and really making laws to still protect women and unborn children. But culturally, there was a giant shift where we, the evangelical church, finally joined the Catholic Church, who had been pro-life for decades, where the evangelical church can sometimes be late to these civil rights movements, and built this infrastructure to serve women seeking abortion. And that's the PRC movement, the Pregnancy Resource Center movement, meant to serve and help women in need who are looking for abortions.
Yeah. And then explain Casey, like what changed there? What was the decision that was made in that case?
Well, Casey was the first time since Roe that they thought that Roe was going to be overturned. And it was really this moment in time where everybody thought, okay, the court's going to overturn Roe. And they didn't. Instead, they said, look, we'll acknowledge Roe is really terribly decided legal reasoning. So we're going to gut the reasoning for that decision. But because it's a precedent, we're going to keep it on the books. And that continued abortion up until now.
Mm-hmm. So 30 years goes by, and I feel like pro-life advocates have been waiting in the wings on pins and needles, and then in comes Dobbs versus Jackson. So if you could explain to us, why do you think the Supreme Court wanted to address this case? What makes it the case to address?
It's known as the case because after 50 years of abortion, we now know so much more about the life developing in the womb. Science and medicine has advanced, society has advanced. I always say this isn't our mother's 1973. And so this is the time the court makeup is different on this issue. And Dobbs was really a case designed around protecting children in the womb who can feel pain, which is by 15 weeks.
So I was paying attention to some of the oral arguments and want to bring up the idea of like a legal precedent, like how there was 50 years of Roe, and yet some of the argument from like Justice Clarence Thomas was like, where do you find the right to abortion in the Constitution? But we've got 50 years, so why change now?
Well, the Supreme Court overrules its own precedents all the time. Every single year, they're overruling maybe 2 or even 3 of their old precedents. So it's actually a very common thing to do. And I'm grateful that they do that, because if they didn't overrule precedents, we would still have Plessy versus Ferguson and segregation as nationwide law in our country. And so really, it's the court's duty to move along with society and protect the vulnerable. And sometimes that requires overruling old precedents.
Yeah. One other thing on that is, like, where do we get the right to abortion, or maybe even where would you point to the right to life in the Constitution?
Right. So I would say that the right to abortion actually doesn't exist in the Constitution. As you mentioned, Justice Thomas asked in the Dobbs case, their attorney, where is the right to abortion? Where would you point to? And she didn't answer him, and that was for a reason. They kind of talk about in the 14th Amendment, there's the right to life, liberty, and property. And so the justices have read into that a right to privacy, or as we would call it, like bodily autonomy in the abortion context. But you've probably heard this before, where your rights begin, my rights end. And so in the context of the child in the womb is its own separate person from its mother. And so it does have its own rights, a right to life, as the 14th Amendment would say.
Yeah. Okay, so certainly there are other laws that we could unpack and talk about, but those seem to be the big ones. And there are going to be other ones in the future. But let's shift and talk about the role of government and kind of each level real quick. I want to start just by asking, like, internationally, how does the U.S. government compare to other nations and their laws around abortion?
I would say the United States is actually really behind on the humanity of the child in the womb. And so most Western states, or Europe, for instance, you can't have an abortion after 12 weeks or your first trimester in those countries. But internationally, we're really more aligned with Russia, China, and North Korea, because we have many states where you can obtain an abortion up until birth without any limitation.
Yeah. So then at a federal level, how does the president, the Supreme Court, and Congress kind of work together? Like, what's the significance whenever we're considering voting, and, you know, how those interplay together on this issue?
Yes, I think at the federal level, the most important thing to understand is that the presidency really has a huge impact on this issue. First, because the presidency is the role that actually appoints federal judges. And so 99% of abortion cases or pro-life cases are going to be decided by hundreds of federal judges at the lower court level. And the president can appoint hundreds of them in his time. He also obviously appoints the Supreme Court. So that's a huge pivotal role that he plays. But he also is in charge of helping where these funds go. Almost $1 billion goes to Planned Parenthood of federal money, and he can have the opportunity to stop that or increase it.
Yeah, and then I think I would just jump in and say abortion shouldn't be a partisan issue. Like, I think we all want to agree that caring for women is vital in our communities, upholding their dignity and respect and honor, knowing that they're made in God's image, and then simultaneously that the preborn need to be cared for, need to be protective, that there are implications to that. We might unpack that a little bit here in a minute when we talk about kind of what our response is as believers. Would you talk about then the role of the state and what state legislatures do?
Yes, so when you're looking on your ballot and you get down to the words state senator and state representative, that's really where all of the legislation that either protects life or ends it begins. Those are the guys who are drafting these bills and passing these bills. And as soon as they pass those bills out of your state legislature, where do they get challenged? Federal court, back to where those appointees are from. And so that's kind of how all of this works together. I mean, I think it's really important to know all the way down your ballot who you're voting for.
Yeah, so when you say federal court, it's not just the Supreme Court, it's these lower level courts that the president's appointing that's having to interact with state legislation.
Yes.
Is that, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so then on a local level, like I've got a mayor, I've got commissioners in my county court that, are in charge of some things and tax, I don't know. What role do they play, if any?
So there have been some recent trends at the local level that are really noteworthy. At the local level, some cities are passing what they call sanctuary city ordinances for the unborn. And so that means within city limits, a abortion provider can't conduct abortions. So that's been an interesting thing to know at the lower level. And then also local district attorneys. They're the ones charged with prosecuting homicide. They're the ones when Roe is overturned that they're going to be charged with prosecuting the abortion providers. And so even knowing who your district attorney is really crucial.
I feel like with all this context that Christians have been accused over the years of being too politically engaged in politics. And then I would say on the flip side of the coin, they've also received this criticism that they've been too politically neutral. So my question to you is, can Christians be politically neutral? And if not, then how do they engage winsomely and in a way that still protects women and children and protects the preborn?
Right. I think that I would start with saying that Christians are salt and light to the world. And wherever lightness isn't, darkness prevails. And so we have a duty to engage in every arena in our world. There should be no arena as a Christian that is off limits to us and the gospel message of love and truth. And then the second thing I would say is to remember the heart of the pro-life movement is one of understanding that each person is created in the image of God. God has a plan for that person, gifts and talents for that person, and Jesus was willing to die for that child in the womb. And so if he was willing to die for the child in the womb, we should have courage of our convictions that we have a righteous, godly plan on our side for it, and we have a duty to engage.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm like, I want to be practical as we're giving people kind of next steps and being thoughtful about that. And so when it comes, it's sort of the hot button, like, are you a single issue voter? And so is this just going to waylay every other important issue that might be out there? And I would say from some perspective, to recognize that if you're a single issue voter on abortion and like that's the only thing that really matters to you, or it's the primary thing that matters, I don't think it's helpful to reduce it down to, and that may be what we've done, or that it's among the many important issues, regardless of kind of how you weigh that. What we don't want to communicate is that somehow qualifies or is a litmus test for your salvation or anyone's salvation. That's probably not going to be a winning argument when you're engaging with someone. And yet, there is this sort of moral priority that I think we need to be thoughtful about when it comes to abortion. And so how would you unpack that idea, this sort of moral priority of why it's, or even how you've evolved on that, of making it the critical issue that you consider first?
I think it's a really important question because if you're like me, you have about 100 issues on your ballot you care about. And so how do you grapple with where all of these lie? And I think the first thing to think about is what's the consequence of that issue remaining unresolved. And in the abortion context, it's the only issue on your ballot that the consequence is death. Almost 1 million children a year are dying because of abortion. And so that should create an urgency in you. It's the single greatest cause of death in the world. And so that's kind of how I weighed that issue. And then the other thing to think about is some of the other ramifications that flow from abortion.
Yeah, I know we talked about like the different positions that are elected offices and their impact on, but it didn't seem like we went through any particular role that it's just like, oh, they don't play a part. It's not important. And so that's got to be a consideration for every vote that we cast. And I don't want to reduce our political engagement to voting by any means. It's not the least we can do, and it's not the most we can do either, but it's a responsibility that we have. But what are the implications of, because sometimes we silo abortion into like this, that's all it affects is the preborn, the mom even, and we don't think about its impact on, like, if you don't have the right to life, what happens downstream of that?
Right. So I think that's a huge question because we have 50 years now where we've seen almost this social experiment of abortion in our country. And now we know so much more about the consequences that it's caused. So one of those being, if you care about racial injustice or racial justice issues, you can't talk about minority communities and representation without also talking about the fact that half of the Black population is missing almost because of abortion. You have to talk about the root of abortion being eugenics. Its founder, Margaret Sanger, wanted to eliminate minority populations. I mean, that's a racial justice issue right there. You can't talk about human trafficking without talking about the fact that abortion is the number one tool traffickers use to keep their victims working and enslaved. That's horrible. There's also things like women are perpetuating abuse cycles when they have abortions, and there's a lot of abortion coercion happening for women in the domestic violence context. So abortion really might impact a much broader scale of things than we really knew to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's obviously important, especially knowing like we care about those things. We see those throughout Scripture. And so maybe two other things that we would just encourage you with. One is we know you can't be informed on all the things. And so we've provided some trusted resources so that you can connect and be informed about updates that are going on related to abortion legislation, connecting you with resources and organizations that do great work in those spaces, but also want to make sure that you do your homework. Like this isn't one of those things that we would just say, hey, trust them, they'll be fine. If they say they're pro-life, then great. And you can just be done with whatever work you needed to put in before you go cast a vote. So be thoughtful about those things, understand the political process and some of the complexity that's involved. But then lastly, you need to know who your legislators are. You need to know who your elected officials are and begin praying for them. So that's your homework, is find out who represents you at every level of government. You might make contact with their office and just say, how can I pray for you? And so thank you for jumping in with us. We realize that politics can feel like a weighty topic, but obviously having Chelsea with us lightens the load. So we'll see you in session 11.